anything that can be designed can be redesigned. And it was such a simple phrasing. And it really got me to think about, we think about a lot of norms that we live in as just the way things are. And if we can actually go, almost anything that's been designed can be redesigned, and it gives us a lot more agency in the process.
Welcome to Thought Sparks. Like, subscribe, comment, share, and enjoy.
Well, welcome everyone to another edition of Thought Sparks. And I'm Rita McGrath. And my guest this week is Nilofer Merchant, who has been a longtime friend of mine, all the way back to, my goodness, Thinkers 50. How many years ago was that? When you ran the cheering squad for the Oscars of Management Thinking.
2013. That was 2013 when I won that Future Thinker Award.
Yeah. Oh, right. Yeah. So that's a while now. Anyway, Nilofer has been many things in life. She has been a chief product evangelist. She's made her name at many, many large tech companies, has been an advisor, has been as you just heard, an award-winning thinker. And for today's purposes, we're going to talk about her most recent book, which is called Our Best Work: Break Free from the 24 Invisible Norms That Limit Us. It's a terrific book, I have to say, and it's just incredibly rich. So we're going to try to do it justice in the time that we have to talk about it. So welcome.
Thank you for having me.
It's such a pleasure. So you wrote this book in, a very complicated time for yourself. And I wonder maybe if you put the book in context, because you've written other books. I mean, this is your fourth or fifth one now?
This is my fourth book.
Yeah, and the one that kind of put you on the map was Onlyness. And I know that was how I first became aware of your work. And this idea that all of us has something uniquely bring into our spaces, and that only we can do, and that what organizations do, often without anybody meaning to, but sometimes with people meaning to, is shut that enormous amount of potential and creativity down.
Yeah. Onlyness was really born out of this economic idea that if we're living in an ideas economy, then ideas come from that distinct point of view each person has. And therefore, onlyness, right, that spot in the world only one stands in, is actually the single unit of value creation. And that then connected together, we can actually do things that once only large organizations or the money could do. And that represents an opportunity for all of us to kind of step into this new economy with creativity and ingenuity and all of that. And then this book follows, it's much more a team-based book, which is what is it that actually allows us to connect and relate to each other in a way that will allow us to do our best work. Because it's not enough for any individual to own their point of view. It's how we then come together, right? And join together, not based on politics or on hierarchy, structural issues, identity in terms of gender issues, all those different ways in which we can structure ourselves, but actually structure ourselves around the work and then do something more meaningful as a result.
And I think this is really prescient, because what I'm seeing in I work with a lot of large organizations, but what I'm increasingly seeing is the unit of value creation is teams, even individuals. And now with AI, right, the cost of starting something, the cost of creating an output that somebody would be willing to pay for is trending towards near zero. We've got companies like Lovable, the software company. They got to something like $200 million in sales before they had the time to hire a salesperson. I mean, it's just wild. And so a lot of these big organizations, which have this, legacy hierarchy and all these legacy processes and stuff, we're seeing a whole new way of operating emerge. So I want to begin right at the beginning of the book, because you talk about the concept of being caged. And which I think is interesting. And the book really does talk about 24 norms. So it's kind of dense. And I will refrain from the wish to say, well, what's the most important one? Because they're all interconnected. And I really love the way that you frame that, that sort of birdcage sort of image, because it's not one thing, it's not the other thing, it's the whole gestalt all put together. And each of them plays a role in keeping us where we are.
It's difficult to write a book like that, right? Because most business books, and you and I read and write business books, so we're not being disparaging when we say this comment, most business books are a single idea that are then, you show enough examples of it kind of thing, but you mostly repeat yourself. And I don't mean that necessarily badly, it's perfectly acceptable to do that. I actually did something kind of complicated, which is I basically said, listen, the reason we're stuck is because something invisible to all of us, but it's not one thing. It's a series of interrelated things. And so we can't just focus on one thing, because then even if we solve that, we won't actually be able to make the progress that we want. And so we have to start thinking about it as what's the interwoven, interlinked ways, and to embrace that complexity, because the world is complex. And so why are we trying to simplify it down? Why don't we actually own the fact that team leading is one of the most complex things, despite it being called soft skills? It is the most complex thing that any one of us leaders does. It's not the, having done strategy, having done innovation, having done technology deployment, et cetera, et cetera. I actually know people leadership is the toughest thing that we all.
So one of the stories that's very vivid from your book is the moment that Steve Jobs returned to Apple, and you had to give a presentation to him, and maybe bring our listeners into that moment with you.
Absolutely. So I was 20 something in this story, and the division that I was a part of was the server division, which when I first joined it was $2 million. And we had been handed this problem to say, hey, listen, this product is actually profitable, but it basically is so small. Can you figure out a way to grow it? And the guy who had handed it to me apparently had tried to hand it to other people, this problem. And I just didn't know any better, kind of thing. And I said, sure, I'll go work on it. Right. And so by the time Steve Jobs comes into the building, kind of the resurrection story of him coming back to Apple, I had helped the company grow from $2 million to $180 million, which is really hard to do. And had done it with a bunch of channel partners and with an extended sales team. Just really, we were the only profitable part of the company, and we were the fastest growing part of the company. And so he comes back and he's doing what most leaders do, the business review of everyone come and present, things. And for some reason, my team decided that I would be the spokesperson for the server division, because my project was like sort of the reason why the team had done so well. You got to picture this though. I'm 20 something years old. And I have this big 20-foot slide thing behind me that says something like channel manager or something. But the word channel was in it, and that's important for this next sentence. Steve Jobs comes in, looks at the slide, looks at me and says, fuck the channel. We don't need the fucking channel. I was like, I remember just going, do I excuse myself right now? Right? Like just what's the next step in this move? And I looked over at my boss, who had to be in his 50s, and I was 25 or 26 at this point. And I just looked at him like, any clue? Kind of like, and he goes, no clue. And I was like, okay. And I ended up just going, well, I'm going to at least let him hear the idea, right? I at least owe it to myself to pitch it. So I did the presentation and managed to say all the things that, we had hoped to convince him. What was most interesting about that is beyond that first sort of, moment where he was asserting what was true and not true, then he didn't say a thing during the entire presentation, which was just as much a power play as the first move, which is to say, I'm not going to hear a word you're saying because I've already decided what's about to happen. And I walked out of that conference room in my little Navy suits and stuff, and just so disheartened, because it felt to me like no matter how successful you are, sometimes you can't have a seat at the table. And that's what was so disheartening about it. It wasn't about him hearing me and then deciding that the idea wasn't good. It was him basically deciding before he walked in the room. And that was just tough to watch. And so I had gone back to my desk and just typed up the email saying, yes, I will consider that job opportunity that you've been talking to me about. And I left Apple shortly thereafter to a little startup called Go Live that got bought by Adobe. But it was a tough moment. I remember that. And I just remember thinking, how does anyone handle that? Just to look back at it was a little bit of shock.
Yeah, well, I think, and this is a theme that does run through the book, which is this tension that we have around these deeply embedded systems of power, and how those systems, and I forget the statistic, but you do mention it in the book. There's some like amount of potential that's just kind of overlooked, and the numbers are really big number. It's like in the trillions.
It is, and it's almost as if we as leaders are like, if we were looking at the industrial production kind of model, it's like having 3 production lines and only using one of them. And then we're just kind of like, oh, it's okay if we don't use the other 2 production lines. We'd never do that in a facility because we could see the latency in the system, but we do it all the time at work by not actually enabling all the talent at the table to actually bring their ideas forward and contribute fully.
Yeah. So maybe just let's spell that argument out, because I think I don't want it to get lost in the subtlety. What we're basically arguing is that in an economy which increasingly is a creation economy. It's an economy based on ideas and on services and on people doing things for each other, and less based on the production of material things in a mass production model. In a creative economy, the idea is that each of us can contribute, have potential value, and yet because of the way we've structured our systems of access, exposure, power, resource allocation, all that stuff, we're systematically shutting out huge swaths of the population from being able to make a contribution. And I think that's a really powerful argument. You know?
And I think when people are saying AI will take our jobs, I think what they're saying is it will take the jobs that require no creativity.
Mhm.
And I'm like, good, take those jobs.
Well, yeah, and I think,
And then, but then let's actually figure out how to actually use the ingenuity and creativity of human beings, right? There's a difference between information, which is what I think AI is very good at, and insight, which is actually what great humans are great at. And then more important, intelligence, which is what teams create together.
I love that.
And we're having this conversation about information when we should be talking about insights and that ability to create shared intelligence together.
Absolutely. So before we go further, just back to the book. So if you just joined us, the book is Our Best Worker. Our Best Work. My guest is Nilofer Merchant, the author of this book. And the book actually goes through each of the 24 practices. It sort of outlines what the issue is. It outlines what good looks like what would better look like for one of these practices. And then every single chapter has an exercise at the end that you can do either on your own or with your team or with a partner. And I mean, that's a lot. Like if you did a book club and you just did one exercise a week, that would be half a year's worth of exercises, right?
It's true. And I really do hope people do that though,
Mhm.
right? Because we owe it to ourselves. Work is the way in which the self meets the world. It's a beautiful line from David White.
Mhm.
And ever since I read that line in his poetry, I have been struck with how much it captures that idea.
Mhm.
How the self, capital S, meets the world.
Mhm.
It's our ability to create and contribute into the world. And in doing so, we are made fuller by it.
Mhm.
And so imagine if we actually, I mean, work sucks. What's the data? I think Gallup says something like 80% of people are dissatisfied at work.
Or disengaged, yeah.
Disengaged, right? And that number, by the way, has been flat to trending down for decades now.
Mhm.
And so this is not a matter of like, oh, this is an inconsequential issue.
Mhm.
It is about our aliveness and our economy, which those two are linked.
Mhm.
And so I hope people spend the 24 weeks and actually pair up together. And I'm imagining in the best of worlds that we can create the conversations within our own teams to say, what does good look like? What does best look like for us? How do we start to move in that direction? And then just recognizing that a lot of power can be held in community.
Mhm. Mhm.
And most other books and most other models talk about how you can change, meaning, learn how to speak up or blah, blah, blah. Like there's a whole series of messages we have about individual accountability, show more resilience. Um, and then we have a lot of really big systemic books that talk about, why capitalism is failing us, right, structurally.
Mhm.
And I'm like, well, one's micro and one's macro, but in the middle is the meso layer, which
Mhm.
is that relational layer. And as soon as you change the relational layer, you also happen to change the other two.
Mhm. Well,
And
you
this,
argued throughout the book that some of these things that we get told, so speak up, hold your ground and stuff like that, that they are actually not all that useful or all that helpful.
yeah, it's making someone who's already not being heard the problem, like in
Mhm.
the Speak Up example. And
Mhm.
I remember when Megan Reitz was publishing her book and she had titled it Speak Up, and I had actually read the interior. I said, I think the title is going to do you such a disservice because what you're actually talking about is how do we hear people?
Mhm. Mhm.
And you're going to go against the title of Speak Up because it's the way in which we commonly talk about it.
Mhm.
And I understand the popularity aspect of you got to have name a book, an idea that blah, blah, blah. But I was like, that's actually one of the most detrimental things you could actually keep promoting because what it says is the person who's not being heard is the solution. That's actually not the solution. The solution is to fix the room, right? And I think the line I wrote in the book was fix here, not her,
I love that. I
right?
love that.
And
Yeah.
so if we just have better norms in meetings, like imagine we actually say, hey, no one in this room monologues. We do not take over the room and do a story that we thought about over the shower and do 20 minutes of a recitation of something. We will not do monologues in a room.
Mhm.
That alone would change meeting interactions because we've all been in rooms where someone takes charge in that particular way.
Mhm.
And it takes all the oxygen out of the room and it leaves so little room for all the ideas in the room to actually come up.
Mhm.
And it also teaches us to listen to someone who's basically doing a power play
Mhm.
because monologues are fundamentally that. It's like, I will take up all the space and none of you will have any when I'm done. And most of us sort of like innocently sort of brush it aside like, oh, it's no big deal, but it's a big deal.
Well, and I think in the book, you pay a lot of attention to, behaviors that a lot of people say, oh, well, that isn't a big deal. That's just the way things are. That's just how stuff gets done around here. And you actually make the point that, well, no, if you add all these things up, so back to this cage metaphor, if you add them all up, they lead to an entire system, which, what's the old line? All systems operate as they were designed. And a lot of what we've inherited in our systems were designed to support some other way of being. So what I think you're getting at here is like, let's really understand the consequences of seemingly inconsequential things, which I think is really
Yeah, and for us to also recognize, we're talking about AI and CX a lot in the broader media. And I think there's just such an opportunity to think about how do we redesign work in this major transformational time.
Mhm.
So if you understand that a frame has been designed and we live in that building that someone else designed, we call it home right now because it's all we know. But we can leave that old dusty castle that actually doesn't serve us very well and build something better. Maybe it's the village down by the river, right? And instead of living in the drafty old castle that other people built before us, we can actually go, actually, no, I want more sunlight and I want more blah, blah, blah. And we can start to build something better. I think is it Gail Fairhurst, who was a professor out of University of Cincinnati, that gave me the sentence that said, anything that can be designed can be redesigned. And it was such a simple phrasing. And it really got me to think about, yeah, we think about a lot of norms that we live in as just the way things are.
Mhm.
And if we can actually go, almost anything that's been designed can be redesigned,
Mhm.
then it gives us a lot more
It does.
agency in the process.
Yeah, well, and in the book, you talk a lot about power. What power is. I'm just trying to see if I can find who was the guy who created essentially a whole um, a whole sort of industry, right? Because of the way that he mobilized his networks.
Was it Franklin Leonard in the Hollywood story? Was it that?
Well, let's start with that one. Yeah.
Okay. So Franklin Leonard out of Hollywood had gone there as a really junior person. And apparently one of the lowest level jobs in Hollywood is to do this thing called coverage, which I didn't even know about. And basically coverage is where you read a manuscript and then you have to kind of distill it down to like the Reader's Digest version of a page or two of here's the plot, here's the story, blah, blah, blah. And then you pitch it to say, here's why I think the story is worth buying or not. And he apparently got to see Hunger Games and he got to see the early scripts of a bunch of things. And when he pitched them, he got told, "Oh, Franklin, that female action won't work." That was Hunger Games,
Mhm.
which of course Hunger Games was one of the largest franchises ever. He got told that Will Smith, that black films don't do well abroad.
Right.
Um, right? And there was just all these crazy norms of that industry. And what he did was he actually sent an email out to all the people he knew that he had met in his first year of Hollywood and said, "Hey, help me find the very best scripts, the things that you love." And so he said, he had an ex-McKinsey guy, so he had good Excel skills. He said, I'll collate everything up and send it back to you if you contribute your ideas. So everyone was asked to name films that they loved that hadn't been put into production in the last year, et cetera. Collates that list, and then that list gets circulated everywhere. And people who had been previously pitching and not getting their ideas heard use this social
Ah.
status of it's the list. It's not me. It's the list that says it's good, and get these films into production. And those films have gone on to have some of the best records of Academy Awards and revenue and so on. And so clearly really good. And what he was doing was tilting the question of how the industry was viewing the problem, which was Hollywood needs to make money. So once you start, in that, oh, will it make money question, you start filtering a certain way.
Mm.
But if you say, are we doing the thing we came here to do, which is to tell great stories in Hollywood? That's Hollywood's main job. And that's what Franklin basically asked when he said, what films do you love? What scripts do you love?
Mm-hmm.
He ended up reorienting the industry back to its core mission,
Mm-hmm.
and then gets, that success. And so he's like showing us what all of us can do, which is, how do you own your original point of view? How do you build up with other people? And then how do you actually scale something that doesn't require necessarily money or size? Because that's how the two measures of success have typically been money and size.
Mm-hmm.
Now you can actually say, how do we have impact without having to necessarily be big in the traditional ways?
Oh, and I think that's absolutely something that AI is going to accelerate. But what I love about that story is a lot of the stories in the book have to do with this, I'll call it almost entrepreneurial network effect. So if you think about the way that we build our networks, there's at least two flavors. There's probably many more, but the first flavor are those dense, personal, we can finish each other's sentences, we trust each other, we've worked together for a long time kind of network, right? And that's great for getting stuff done. But then you have these entrepreneurial networks, which feature very prominently in this book, which is people I may have spoken to a couple of times, maybe I have heard of them, maybe they're friends of a friend, but that's where the new ideas, and that's often where the inspiration comes from for something that's quite new. And that's often where you can create the alliances that lead you to some of these new things.
And we often think about that when we think about it from an institutional point of view, and I've been working for a long time. So I'm dating myself when I say this. We often think about those as being on the edge, those people on the edge. And actually, I think the center has moved to the edge. That is actually, we go to the edge and now call it center, because that's where all innovation's actually happening.
Mm-hmm. Super interesting. So say more about that, because I think that's an interesting concept. And I think directionally, you're absolutely right.
It's when I published my second book, and I referenced you quite a bit in it, so it seems a little like I could be kissing your ass right now by saying it, by bringing it up. But you know me well enough to know I don't do that. But it was about how in the networked era, in this sort of ideas economy, how we actually no longer think about value chain work, and that's really the Michael Porter sort of thesis of, we do this, and then we do this, and we do this, and we do this, and we kind of really think about it as a value chain. And I was saying, actually, value creation doesn't work that way anymore. And what we have traditionally thought about is the institution in a silo, and then customers out there.
Mm-hmm.
And I was actually saying, if you can go to, if you stop thinking about there being a wall between you and your partners/customers,
Mm-hmm.
then you will actually understand that it is the intersection of where those walls come down, those sort of places where the circles start to overlap, where you can actually create together. And sort of the best line out of that book is that value is not created, value is co-created.
Interesting.
And right, but it means that we're going to the edge of what we think about as our perimeter,
Mm-hmm.
as an institution, and we actually say, no, it's not about what we're doing within these walls. It's what we're doing with other people.
Mm-hmm.
And then that is the center of value creation.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my favorite examples was when IBM was thinking about doing green stuff, sort of, this is when sustainability was still relatively new. And they were like, well, we should be maybe moving in that space. And they were like, we have no idea where we could add value. And so instead of sitting there getting stuck, they actually said, let's form some advisory groups that could tell us where we might be able to add value.
Mm-hmm.
And they basically showed up. I actually heard some of these stories from a couple of different people. They basically showed up in these rooms where they gathered experts in the green space. And instead of saying, hey, we know stuff, they actually said, we know nothing. Assume we know nothing.
Uh-huh.
And we have a good sense of our capabilities. What we want to understand are, where are the problems that are not being solved that could possibly use those capabilities? And then where would be the best place for us to add value given the ecosystem?
Mm-hmm.
They basically had people start identifying the problems, identifying the opportunities, and then IBM sitting there saying, well, we might be able to play here, we might be able to play here. And they ended up, I think the number was something like 6% growth in the first year in this space. But what's so tremendous about that number is that it represented all blue ocean, all growth area that was invisible to them until they started having these conversations.
Interesting.
So they moved to their edge,
Uh-huh.
and then they called that center, and they started creating value together. And I could tell you another 10 of these, right? Or you could too, because we all know this is actually where the future's going. We just don't have enough evidence yet how to do it, how to go from that place of I should know what to do when I'm in a room to I have no idea what I should do when I'm in this room.
Right.
And sitting in that discomfort of like, I have no idea, but let me learn.
Right. And I think your own life really has been about that philosophy. And I'm just thinking, you know, we probably have some younger folks listening to this podcast. And I often get this question, like, what should I do? And sometimes it comes from a place where people think, you know, I have to have it all mapped out, right? I have to have this grand plan for my life. And I'm like, well, I don't know about you, but my life didn't have that. You know? And I know for sure your life didn't have it. So one thing I did not.
It does not have that, no.
One thing I did not know before reading this book, because I don't think we've ever discussed, is you were supposed to be sold off to an arranged marriage. I did not know that.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
Well, my mother raised 3 children on her own. And when it came time to get us married, she really thought I had the best prospects of getting married well. And so there was a sort of, you know, conversation going around in the family and in the extended community about that. And so they had found a man for me to marry who was his first wife had died, who was ridiculously wealthy. And so they were like, oh, this will be a perfect match, you know, kind of thing. And I actually was game for it, so just to be, you know, honest, because I really wanted to provide for my mother and she was going to get a house out of it. And that would give her stability. And you know, all of us who are immigrants who've come to a country, watched ourselves have to just fight so hard just to be able to make a living and then to raise kids and all that stuff. I wanted to give her what she wanted, but I also wanted something else, which is I wanted an education. And it's not common for that generation to actually believe girls should get an education and so on. But I was definitely an American who wanted an education, and I was definitely like the kid who spent all her lunch hours at the library, right? Like I'm going to go want an education. So I had already applied to schools, gotten into UC Berkeley. Hadn't told my family this little fact though, because I was just hoping that I could somehow slipstream these 2 ideas together of like, they're going to get me married, but then this guy really doesn't need me to do anything because he's rich. He had a nanny and he had a wife and he had, you know, like everything. Right. So, and I was like, oh, then I can go to school. And my uncle would not negotiate that on my behalf because he said, your mother didn't, you know, want that. She wants to negotiate for the house. She doesn't want to add anything else to the list. And so I ended up leaving home, not because I planned on leaving home, but because I thought that I had some leverage in the system. And I thought the leverage was that you can't make the deal without me. So I actually said something like that, you know, saying I was actually like an FBLA kid. Do you know what that is?
No.
Future Business Leaders of America. It's actually a club you can join.
Oh, yeah.
So I was an FBLA kid. And so this formed that sentence in my mind, which is, I'm the product. You can't make this deal without me. So, you know, so like, you know, basically give me what I want kind of thing. And I said, just ask. I said, I'm not expecting it to be a guarantee, but if you ask, I'm pretty sure we can get it. I just didn't want to lose the sort of 1 or 2 or 3 years it might have cost me to kind of then get back into it. And I literally, to make the point, put like a couple books, couple outfits, no toothbrush, and started walking towards the door. The box didn't even have a lid, just to give you perspective. The box didn't even have a lid. I clearly did not have a plan here. And I thought she would stop me at the door. My mother would stop me at the door, and she didn't. And then I thought she would stop me at the end of the driveway, and she didn't. And so then I just had to figure out where I was going, which turned out, by the way, I went to a donut shop and hung out for a couple hours thinking, that seems like a good place to hang out when you're feeling a little lost in life. And my mother never relented. I ended up being therefore homeless and kicked out of the family and all those things right away.
Wow.
But I ended up getting an education.
And how did you make that happen?
I went to community college. Community colleges are a beautiful entrance point into the educational system, and then worked my way through both undergrad and grad. So I basically went to 2 Jesuit institutions because they allowed me to work part-time. And I mean, go to school part-time and work. And so USF out of San Francisco, and then Santa Clara University, my alma mater for my MBA.
And what happened then?
You mean, did I ever get back together with my family, or?
No, just to kind of in your own.
Oh, you know, I started because I could work and go to school. I ended up taking a job as an admin at Apple, even though I had more skill than that. Not to say admin skills are not high. I actually would say I had no admin skills, but I took the admin job because that was what was available. And in fact, the boss who hired me said, I really don't need an admin, but I have a research. I know you really want to do research. So how about you do research 50% of the time and admin 50% of the time?
Oh.
And I was like, sure, that sounds great. And then after a few months, he actually came and took the admin job off my table because I was so terrible at it. And which I find just very funny. I'm like so embarrassed about it. But I'm still kind of bad at admin skills. And so Apple. And then as the Steve Jobs story told you earlier, I went to a little company called Go Live. After that, I went to Autodesk and I ran my own strategy firm. And each of those moments, like each of the moves, I thought, and in fact, I would say I probably had like 5 major inflection points. And each one I thought my career is over. And so I think that's, I think the lesson to the younger people, right, is like, I don't think over is ever over. And you just don't know what comes around the corner.
That's
Using your language, right? It's you do not know what is coming around the corner. And the only thing you know is what you can keep showing up as.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we know how to do that very well because we don't really talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
How to show up even when you don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, and so one of the themes that runs through, I'm just looking at your lenses here. This idea of fighting for the emperor's pleasure and mistaking paternalism for leadership, or progress not power. Real themes around what keeps us sort of stuck. I love the story about the emperor's pleasure. You were in a class, in your MBA class, and the man who you would later marry was like looking at you as though you were so bored, and you had all the right answers, and you just couldn't qualify out of the class. And a story that changed its meaning for you over time. I think is the way I would characterize that.
Yeah.
Looked through it one lens, what a charming, sweet story, and happily ever after, and all that stuff. But looked at through another lens, it's like, you're being put in a situation where somebody is causing you to have to try to please them, right?
So there was this. So I'll just kind of recap the story a little more. So for those of us listening along, so I ended up marrying this man, but this is literally the first moment where we're interacting, and we're sitting in grad school. And the class is going around and round, and you and I have both taught enough where sometimes the discussions just kind of keep going until the group kind of shows up for an answer. And I had been slouched super low in the chair like this kind of thing and just sort of hiding. And the guy beside me is like, "Can you use my sweatshirt?" And here, take my sweatshirt kind of thing. And I was like, "I do not need your sweatshirt." And he goes, "Well, what are you doing?" Because my arms were crossed and I was doing this, slacker behavior. And which I'm sure as professors, they can spot us 42 miles away, but when we're doing it, we think we can't be spotted. But I was sitting there and I was just like really frustrated because I knew the answer. But one of the things about if you really are in a class that you have a lot of domain about, you could keep raising your hand, but then you become that annoying kid in class. Mm-hmm. And so you can't be that person also. And especially as a woman and a brown woman, you're not allowed to be that smart in most firms. So I had just found a coping mechanism, which is I'm just going to sit here and wait for the class to do its thing. And he was shoving his sweatshirt on me. And I was like, "Dude, I already know the answer." And he goes, "No, you don't." There was absolutely no question in his mind that there's like, if everyone in the class didn't know the answer, there is no way that I knew the answer. And so I did the thing that, almost all of us are conditioned to do, which is to raise your hand, give the answer, prove to the person that, yes, I do know what I'm talking about, and then sit back down. And I realize now that particular behavior is something we ask a lot of people to do, which is we make people jump through hoops. Mm-hmm. But certain people have to jump through way more hoops than other people. Mm-hmm. So, one group will be said, "Hey, I can see why that idea is latent and needs some more work, but here's some resources. Let me connect you to some people and then make that idea better." And the other group is treated almost as if they weren't heard. Mm-hmm. And so they're not given that sort of friction and necessary resources to go, "Okay, go make that idea better." Mm-hmm. And because all nascent ideas show up as underdeveloped.
Yeah.
And we're like little fledgling birds, little, and you got to figure out how to feed it and tend it and grow it before it can actually become a real idea that becomes a real and robust solution. And so just the other day, somebody wrote me an email and said, hey, can you come do this thing? And I said, sure, here's when I can do it, blah, blah, blah. And she wrote back and she says, no, I want to meet with you for 30 minutes to talk about whether or not you could do this thing. And I said, I guarantee you that Adam Grant doesn't get asked or Rita McGrath doesn't get asked to spend the 30 minutes to prove they are capable to do the thing. If you asked me, then you probably should have vetted me first, right? Like, it's like, but I know that it's what we're so used to doing. And we get to then waste our time proving our capacity to add value instead of actually adding value. And that's what I think the numbers show between 60 to 70% of people are having to face. And the way I'm talking about it, I'm identifying it through my experience, but it happens with young people, old people, certainly gender issues, certainly race issues, but it can be even marketing people not being valued by engineering people or vice versa. And then getting put through a gauntlet instead of saying, bring it. Let me actually hear it. Let's see if we can give it more of a shot. And then let's go figure out what we want to go do.
I love that. So one of the things I'm starting to see, and I think your book fits really nicely into this, is, we are starting to see organizations that are recognizing that human beings are actually quite amazing. Like, when provided with the ability to exercise agency, when provided with something that motivates and inspires them, and provided with the opportunity to grow, as Dan Pink would say, we can do amazing and astonishing things. And yet, conversely, organizations in many cases don't offer agency. They offer control instead. They don't offer an inspiring mission. They're all about the shareholders. And when it comes to growth, they just want you in your box. And so I find this fascinating contention between what we know works to unleash human potential and then what actually happens in human organizations. And it's quite interesting to me.
And that's exactly where this insight came from, actually, Rita. So, Tim Castell and I formed this organization called Intangible Labs, where we were, and it's just kind of worth kind of backing up how this book got birthed, is we had this thesis of, okay, innovation requires three things, at which like over 100 years of data confirms, from Mary Follett to Drucker to Sutton to Amy Edmondson to you, right? Like all of that. And it basically says you have to have access to new and novel ideas. You have to have enough sufficient friction for it to become, for those ideas to become real and robust solutions. And you have to solve the problems of tomorrow. And those three things are the key to all innovation, but they're also the key to great design thinking or great psychological safety or all the other emerging qualities that show up inside an organization. The same fundamentals lead to that. And so as we were trying to figure out how do we start, why aren't we doing those things? That was the question. Why aren't we doing those things? If we know it, why aren't we doing it? And I said, let's take apart the fact that people are like, because the inclination is people need to know more. And I'm like, actually, I think they know enough. So I don't think it's that. I don't think it's the knowing doing gap. And I don't think it's that we don't want to grow. Let's take those things off the table and go, okay, now what is it? And Tim and I sat there and realized, well, we're doing other behavior right now that is driven by the metrics of capital. So we're optimizing for profit, we're optimizing for productivity, et cetera, because those are the measures we can actually track. And so we said, okay, well, we probably need better measures. Well, not even better, but better measures for the intangibles, because we can measure the tangible, but we're missing the measures for the intangible. And so we started working on that. And then as we got through that, that's basically what formulated the 24 chapters, is because we thought, okay, well, if we're going to know if people are going to be good at innovation, we'd have to know that they'd be open to new ideas. Okay, if we're going to be open to new ideas, how would we, if we could observe the behavior, what would we observe inside the organization? And we said, oh, they'd be good at having difficult conversations, for one. And the next is they would actually deal with the problem, not the person bringing the problem. And the next one is they'd be good at figuring out how to prioritize meaningful problems over immediate money. And the next one was, and we just went through and identified them, but we realized that even if we could name them, we needed to explain to people that they were doing something right now that was actually limiting their capacity to do the better thing or even the best thing. And that's where this book ended up coming out, is not because I wanted to write another book, because as you know, it's hard to write a book, incredibly hard in this day and age to even get it known because the noise level of everything is so high.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we're like, okay, well, we need to explain what's the limiting factor and then what's the leading indicator.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully this is part one of many things that we'll be bringing in, which is how do we get to the metrics of tomorrow?
I love that. So was it your book where you talk about a book called something like Who Made Adam Smith's Dinner?
Oh, it was Katrin Massel, who's a Swedish author. And oh my God, such a good book.
I don't have it yet, but I remember reading the section in your book, and I was thinking, and I have actually written about this, which is since Adam Smith, right? We've been measuring productivity in terms of typically manufacturing output, right? And yet all the things that make life truly worth living, culture, art, caring, growth, education, cooking dinner, all those things don't sort of get factored into the productivity equation. And in fact, William Baumol, who's was a very respectable economist, coined something he called Baumol's cost disease. And his argument was as follows, that the productivity of symphony orchestras, let's say, has not improved in 400 years because it takes you the same amount of time with the same number of musicians to play the same piece of music, as it did decades ago. And yet the salaries for those sectors of the economy go up even as their productivity is stagnant. And his thesis was that the productive parts of the economy generate enough surplus to cover the unproductive parts, and that, because you need employment in those parts, the cost goes up. I happen to take a different perspective on that, which is, I think, if we can generate economic surplus so that we can go into these other things that are so much more human, where's the measurement for that, right? And
intangibles. And the market says, I think it's something like 84% is currently intangible. So we can measure 16% of market value. So like in the S&P 500, we can trace patents, employee costs, buildings, etc. We cannot trace the other stuff. So it's just considered an intangible asset. Right. And yet that is actually what's actually allowing us to create value.
Yeah. Well, and I actually looked at a study that did this, and the study started in, I think, 1970. Maybe 70, it was either 70 or 75. But the person doing it looked at, what were the tangible versus intangible assets on the books of like the Fortune 500. And it was 92% at that time was tangible, plant, property, equipment, all that stuff. If you take the same slice of the same kinds of companies today, it's completely the inverse. It's only about 10% maybe or less that's tangible, and everything else that's adding value are these intangible assets. And so I kind of think the way that we measure productivity is kind of messed up. The other thing,
that's what Katrin Marcel's saying right in the book, because we're taking direction from someone like Adam Smith from an economic model. And my undergrad's in econ, and I really fundamentally think about myself as an economist, but he basically discounted the people who made his life work, right? The people who did his laundry, his mother who fed him, the house he lived in, the love that nourished him, all of that didn't get to count. And he basically wrote the whole idea that people are interested, should be self-interested and only worry about their own sort of striving, right? Their own achievement, independent of other things. And then it'll all kind of work out. So, and yet I'm like, well, your mother who was feeding you was not just focused on her own individual striving, right? And the people in your community who were tending the community were not just focused on their own individual striving. And so it's interesting to me that we take such leadership, or we take advice from people who are not actually serving our interests.
That's true.
If we don't have love, and we don't have care, and we don't have connection, that is not a life.
Right. Yeah, we're all just like economic models. So this is kind of an interesting future-oriented thing. But if you think about, as I said, if the unit of value creation, and together with agentic AI, there can be an awful lot of value created by very inexpensive systems to build. If the unit of value creation becomes individuals or small teams, then in the future, are we really going to need these megalithic corporations that foster these norms, right? That are really homes for a lot of these norms that are kind of holding us back. And instead, could we be thinking about loosely knit ecosystems of people that come together to add value in whatever way that makes sense? And then how do we go about measuring that, right? which I think is really interesting.
I mean, I think it's like two things there, right? One is, are we going to be able to do more using small teams connected together to achieve big goals? Yes. And is it the end of, organizations as we know it? I hope not, because the original reason we ever joined a team, I certainly had this when I joined Apple, is not that I want to join a big global, whatever, and get lost in the mix of it. I want to join because then we could do something bigger than any of us could do alone. And that, I think, still is our highest value. Like, the reason we join teams is not because we want to give up something. We actually want to get something. We want to work in collaboration with other people. We want to get sparked by other people's ideas. We want to help build something bigger than any of us can do alone. And so I think we're really looking for an evolution or maybe a revolution of what it is we're driven by. One of the things I wrote in the book was that there are three types of teams. The one where you join and you're smaller than what you can do on your own. Somehow everyone around you just makes you kind of shrink and you just do as little as possible, or nothing really seems to make any motion. Then there's the one where it's additive. You do your part, the next person does their part, et cetera, et cetera. And, the sum of those things equals what we do. And then there's the thing when we come together and we do something so much bigger than any of us could do alone. And I labeled those diminished and additive and raised. And so in writing this work, and certainly my own vision for how we move forward, is how do we go from crappy ass teams where we could be just additive or diminished to the kinds of teams we actually all know are possible, and actually figure out how to do that. And in the book, I also provide beautiful examples from Gore and some other companies of doing that kind of work and saying, why don't we move towards that and then move from, give us the chance to do our best work.
Which is the title of the book, right? So what do you hope happens next? What would you like to see this lead to?
Okay, I'm going to paint a big picture.
Good. Love that.
So I used the title Our Best Work, and I basically start the book with just defining what those three words could mean. Our can mean a small group or a large group. It could also be about, the investors all the way up to the earth. And so depending on how we scope our, it changes who you're serving, who gets the value distribution of that. The word best could be about, are we making the most amount of money, or are we solving the most meaningful problems? And work can be defined as, is it the contract and the scope of the box that I'm put in, or is it the calling that uses my fullest gifts, my onlyness? And those represent not just linguistic choices, but about an economic model. Mm-hmm. And so if we think about our and best and work being mostly about investors and money and people being put in jobs today, our economy is underdeveloped as a result. Mm-hmm. But if we go to the model of we can be more expansive of who is served, if we can expand work to solve more meaningful problems, and we can build out the very best of people, then we have a different economic proposition. And so when I say I'm really aiming for like this big picture, I'm like, let's reimagine what work could be so that we grow the economy. And in the process, we also grow our own human aliveness, because those two are so deeply linked. So that's what I hope for.
I love that. And, I think that there is historical precedent for how this might happen, right? So as you may be aware, like I'm a huge fan of Carlotta Perez's theory of technological revolutions, and we're right in the middle of one right now. And so the old one, right, which is based on colonial principles of extraction from the earth, right? Cheap energy in global supply chains where, everything's really rigid and it's all about mass production and create 1,000 widgets that are all exactly the same, right? That old model is still hanging in there. I mean, it's clinging on with bare fingers. And the new one hasn't quite yet emerged. And capital is still in the casino. The world is just flooded with capital right now. Debt ratios are really high. So we're due for some kind of reckoning, right? And it isn't until capital comes out of the casino and starts lining up with these much more kind of production-oriented, human-oriented forces, will we get to that next stage, which could be much more human, and it could be what Carlotta calls a golden age. But that's going to take design. We're going to have books like yours and people that are paying attention to, the small things, right? Well, seemingly small things. They're not small things, but they often pass unnoticed in the course of an ordinary day at work, right? And so, but I think it needs to be designed, right?
And one of the things I'm actually thinking is the lever of change is metrics, this intangible metrics part. And the reason is I was watching when Paul Pullman was at Unilever and doing just really amazing work at helping that company be more mission oriented, be more collaborative across sectors so that they solved real meaningful problems from sanitary issues and so on. And I write about him in the book. But as soon as Paul left, the company largely just reverted back to what they had done before. Right. And it's because in my mind, they didn't have the metrics in place to say, how would we know whether or not we're on track for doing these things? And so the door sort of shuts behind a good leader like that back to what it was before because they aren't there holding it open. And I saw the same thing when Beth Comstock was at GE. I've seen, just across, because I've just worked with so many great leaders that I'm like, yeah, we need better metrics. And if we can show people their own progression around those metrics too. So you can say, hey, I'm not great at accessing new and novel ideas. I'm maybe a 3.1 on a scale of 1 to 5. I know that if I get to a 4, I can probably outperform my competitors. Okay, now what would be the set of things that we would do? And we can actually build in protocol, which is what we're starting to say is start doing this behavior, the leading indicators behavior, and you get to a different outcome. Because right now we're so focused on outcomes. The detriment of everything else. And I'm basically saying if we manage the how, we can get to a better what.
That's great. That's really great. So I do like the idea of metrics. And, there are starting to be examples of companies that are kind of getting the message. I think a very interesting experiment's going on right now at Bayer, where they're promoting something they're calling DSO. What does that stand for? Something like devolved self-ownership or something like that. But it's really taking this principle of let's make these teams able to rise to the best that they can perform because they're not being sort of told what to do or put in a box or whatever. So we're seeing some early little flashes of that, but it's certainly not the norm at the moment.
Yeah, and I think if we had more, if we could hand this book to the team at Bayer and say, you've probably got 5 of these principles down. What are the other ones that you want to pick up and see? I was just talking to a leader who says, I'm pretty good at this. I'm pretty good at this. I feel like I'm missing blah, blah, blah. And we were like, oh, and we were able to kind of figure out what was he still missing? What are the building blocks that we need in order to build in this way? And he was basically able to say, I got this, I got this, I got this. And he did. And he was still missing things, which is one of the reasons I did the full 24. God bless it. I had so many friends. One of my favorite people in the world is a woman who first coined the term social innovation. She actually started the SSRI, Social Innovation Review magazine, and all the work at Stanford. Brilliant, lovely woman, great leader, pioneer, etc. And she would look at me and say, this is too many. This is just too many. And this, by the way, maybe 30 minutes from, oh my God, if we actually did these things, it could solve everything. And so I go, you got to link these two thoughts a little more closely together.
I love that.
You're right, because I'm like, I get that we want simplicity. And if we're going to actually solve this unbelievably complex problem, got to actually say it's an unbelievably complex problem. And redesigning it means understanding multiple aspects of it for us to get there.
Well, so just, for those listening, because I really, I believe in what you're doing here, and I think it's super important. So each chapter, I don't know if you can see it visually, but each chapter has an actual exercise that you can do, and with very specific instructions about, how do I begin to think about fixing this practice? So there's, value disruption, you've got innovation practice, even overstatements. And the goal is knowing how to name what matters most to you. And then there's an exercise, right, about going through how do you actually figure out where for you as a person, value is created or not, and how do you get to know that? So I thought that was really remarkable. I mean, most books they'll have like a workbook or something at the end of the book. They don't actually say, here's how you get to fix this thing, right? In all of its richness and all.
I just wanted to get it priming the pump, right? It's like for anything. Like when I'm working out, I need to understand the form factor of what a deadlift feels like so that when someone teaches me good form, I can lift heavier and heavier. And so I was like, what is the thing that I can basically prime the pump and teach you good form? And then you can actually go from here because I can teach you enough to go be able to do it right. And that's what I was working on with practices. I think the next step will be working on sort of what are team interventions. So I'm hoping to get to work with teams and then, show up like, because you and I could probably even do that together, go into teams and be like, here's the best intervention for this kind of problem. Here's the best intervention for this kind of problem. And then almost be able to measure their progression on these goals over time. Right? Because I think that's the one thing we're still missing is like, okay, if I invest in team stuff, whatever the team stuff is, how do I know if it's actually making a difference in my innovation capability?
Right. So at Intangible Labs, you work with clients. I presume you have companies that come in.
Yeah, in fact, very soon, like very, very soon, maybe even by the time this podcast comes out, we're going to be able to have an instrumentation live. So people can actually take the research, actually be able to take a survey and know where they are on a scale.
Wow.
I know, right? So exciting. And then be able to know what the upside is if they fix that problem, which is, just like you can get 2 to 4% uplift if you do this one thing. And so we were able to like track it down and then they can come back and do the survey 6 months later and a year later and be able to see their own progression. So that's really exciting for us. And then, we're working with teams. We want to be able to figure out how to, when I first came up with the name Intangible Labs, you'll notice there's an S at the end of labs. And the reason is I didn't want to build a consultancy. I didn't want to build a think tank. I wanted to build a learning context so that the metrics are something we build together. And so the idea is I certainly have a lot of ideas for what those metrics could be and should be. And as we deploy with real working situations, we'll be able to improve that situation. So each deployment becomes its own lab. And then we can go, okay, what do we learn from there that would help us make the measures better and improve that so that every instantiation gives us an opportunity to get closer to what will actually help people move forward.
That's brilliant. That's just great. So I presume you have a website, Intangible Labs?
Intangiblelabs.com. I think it's not Intangible Labs because we couldn't get Intangible Labs, but yeah.
And is there any other thing people should do? I mean, obviously get the book, do some of the exercises, and most of them are not time consuming. I mean, it holds a lot of people. I
designed it so that like if you and I were buds on a team, you and I could just be like, okay, independently of everyone else, how could we actually figure this thing out? And so I designed it so that it could start in dyads. Yeah. Because I think what you need is somebody who's a buddy to be like, how do we make work better?
Right. Well, one that I really like is the one you call consequencing, which is designed to regulate team dynamics towards desired behavior. And this is a mistake I see a lot of senior leaders in organizations make, right? They'll say to their teams, oh, you're empowered, and then walk away. And the teams are like, what does that even mean? And so, you can't empower people or give them agency is a better way of, or give them the right to their own agency is the way I think about it, but without any instruction, right? I mean, I need to be taught how to give you useful feedback. I need to understand how to have difficult conversations. I need to know when it's okay to, call somebody out for something they didn't deliver that they were supposed to, and, right? And so I think there's a real need to remember that, watching somebody do a backflip on a, Olympic thing is not going to make you any better at doing backflips. You actually have to do it.
Right. That's right. And we can all help each other so much. I think small teams could start this right now. Yeah. Like figure out a thing that you guys want to do better, deploy one of the things and just start. So I actually imagine small teams being the place where this adoption will happen, and then it will grow over time, because I think if any, I meet a lot of sort of what I'll call mid-level managers, directors, et cetera, who are running great teams, and they're so disheartened by how much they have to protect their people from. And so if they could just create a little enclave of best work, they'd be so much happier for it. And that will spread over time. Right? Because goodness always spreads. I found that in every consulting company, whenever I was doing consulting, back when I was doing that, our team would be successful and people would almost kind of like look over, kind of like being like, what are you guys doing right kind of thing. And so then they would want to borrow some of the principles we were doing. And that's kind of what I think we all have to just do is like, just spread goodness where we can.
Oh, that is just such a great note to end on. Well, thank you so much for spending the time with me. For those who are just like at the end of it, the book is Our Best Work, a breakthrough from the 24 invisible norms that limit us. And I appreciate this, and let's go make it happen.
Thank you, Rita. So glad to be here with you.
Thank you.